welcome everybody to the study session of January 9th, 2018. I don't know where April came from. Anyhow, we have two topics tonight. I guess we're just going to jump right into Central Broadway, yeah?
Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening. My name's Molly Scarborough. I'm a senior project manager for the Public Works Department. We're here today to provide information and get feedback from you on our approach to area planning for the Alpine Balsam site and nearby surrounding areas. We will also provide an update on our analysis of the potential for reuse of the existing medical pavilion on the site and discuss our approach for evaluating financing and partnership strategies for the area plan implementation concurrent with area planning. So to facilitate the discussion of each of these separate but interrelated topics, we've divided the presentation into two parts. In first, Leslie Ellis, Comprehensive Planning Manager, will provide background information on the Central Broadway framework and objectives that will guide area planning for two of the Central Broadway areas over the next year. The Alpine Balsam area, which will be the focus of our presentation tonight, as well as the Civic Area East Bookend. Then Caitlin Zacharias and Jean Gatza will present the approach to Alpine Balsam area planning and community engagement. We'll then break for about an hour for council conversation and questions and feedback on these items. In part two, Michelle Crane with the Public Works Facilities and Asset Management Group will describe the analysis of the reuse of the potential for the medical pavilion, staff conclusions, and next steps for renovation of the building. Amanda Beavis will then discuss our plans for developing a financing partnership strategy for implementation of both the Alpine Balsam and East Bookend area plans and the potential city facilities within them. I'll follow up with a brief recap of next steps, and then we'll break for a 30-minute discussion of these items. Wanted to let you know, in addition to these presenters, we have additional staff in the audience who may be able to come up and answer questions as needed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Leslie.
Okay, good evening. So as Molly mentioned, tonight we are here to begin with you a process as part of our community's vision, really to implement the comprehensive plan. And as expressed in the comprehensive plan, we strive together to create and preserve a truly special place that is sustainable, resilient, equitable, and inclusive. And this part of these projects are really part of implementation toward our inspired future as part of the work that we do in planning. So after several months of working with this team across the city and reaching out with the community and hearing some feedback, I'm honored to be part of this group here who's here this evening, and I'll be handing off most of the presentation to Caitlin and Jean shortly. But first, I'll provide a bit of context and background and share the planning objectives with you for the project. And we are initiating with you, as you can see on the map up there in yellow, and I'll click the button here, two area plans, and we'll talk about what those are in a moment. But they are, as Molly mentioned, the Alpine Balsam, the former hospital site that you see in the north circle on the map there, and then secondly, the Civic Area East Bookend. This is the east side of the Civic Area. It includes portions of Central Park and the 13th and 14th Street blocks. So you'll be receiving an information packet about the East Bookend site and the conditions on that site in a couple of weeks, so we won't spend a lot of time on that this evening. But there is quite a bit of backdrop for the work that we're beginning now. It's not a blank slate. We've done a lot of work with you all as council with the community on the projects that you see up there on the screen. So the Central Broadway Corridor Design Framework was approved back in June of last year. That provides quite a bit of background and the interrelationships about the 5 centers along Broadway, as well as the Alpine Balsam Vision Plan. You'll hear a bit more about that as well. That was also approved in June of last year. And recently we've been seeing the fruition of a lot of that past planning work and community engagement, as you saw in the recently opened Civic Area Park, as well as the University Hill Event Street and some of the activities that are currently happening up there in a public gathering space. So this will set us forward on the next stage of implementation around those areas. So what is an area plan? And this brings us to the definition of that. And as you heard a bit last week in our discussion about sub-community plans and area plans, they are guided by the comprehensive plan and its criteria. area plans implement or bridge higher level policies of the comprehensive plan with a more specific detailed zoning, development review, comprehensive capital investment decisions, and so on, as you see on the chart there on the left side of the screen. They tend to focus on areas of opportunities or where we see special problems or areas that might be likely to change in the community, and by their nature then tend to be a bit smaller in geographic scope. The ones that we've done in the past have ranged from 6 acres to 160 acres. To put Alpine Balsam in perspective, it's approximately 70 acres, so it's right in that range. The last plan we completed was Junior Academy in 2009. So it's been a few years since you or Planning Board or we have undertaken an area plan with the community. And you'll hear a little bit later about community engagement. When we do an area plan, that doesn't mean that only people who are affected within the boundary of the plan are invited to participate. I think it's important to point out that this is a community-wide interest, and so there are people who are more directly influenced and affected by the work that's done here, but there will be outreach that is much broader than that as well. We, for Iris and Broadway, we are also coordinating with the county on the matter of planning to address the possible co-location of facilities on the site. We don't yet have options that we're looking at, but we do plan to bring some ideas and options to you later in the spring. We're also speaking with county staff about what the planning effort for that site at Iris and Broadway might be, whether that might be an additional area planning type of effort or something to that effect. So stay tuned for that, and certainly if you have any thoughts or ideas, we'd welcome those, but we'll be bringing more information forward later on that. We also know that some council members are very interested in simultaneously exploring a sub-community plan for the area immediately around this site, and we're not prepared tonight to talk about all the issues around that. We do anticipate that as a conversation that would continue as part of the retreat and as part of that topic around sub-community planning. I think I mentioned, as just for rough context, the Iris Broadway site is about 70 acres, and then just in the context that North Boulder subcommunity area there is about 1.5 miles square, and it's largely residential, and you'll hear a bit more about the Alpine Balsam site, which is much more of a mix of uses within the site. We've defined 8 objectives for the area planning process that are built from a lot of the previous efforts that we've engaged in and from early input from the community and from the city's engagement framework. And you can see these are also on pages 4 and 5 of your memo. We are looking for your input on these this evening, and just to be sure that we're all aligned as a team as we move forward with you all. You can see on the screen here the first 4 relate to the community's vision and values, sustainability, resilience, and so on, respect our legacy and context of previous work, get at the notion of a robust engagement process that you'll hear more about, and acknowledge that we need to do a lot of coordination with some of the other efforts that are underway, particularly the city facilities, flood mitigation, and so on. So that's all taking place. In addition, the next 4 address engagement with the community to define our community values that are important to all of us, to pursue consolidation of city facilities. And then also, you'll hear more in the presentation later about this notion of it's going to take a wide range of approaches to make the community's vision a reality. And so talking about financing and partnerships. And then last but not least, it's going to be very important to make sure that we do this in a timely and efficient manner so that we're ready to move forward as the hospital vacates the site next year. After this next part of the presentation, we'll pause briefly, and we would really appreciate your feedback around these objectives. So I will now hand it over to Caitlin Zacharias, who will share the initiation of the Alpine Balsam project, including some overview and background around that, the components of what would go into the area plan, the purpose statement, the planning area definition, and some of the considerations. And then she'll hand it over to Jean to talk about community engagement.
Thanks, Leslie. I'll start off with a bit of background. The city purchased the site in December of 2015, and there were two main reasons for this. First, it was to ensure that redevelopment of the site fits with the community's goals and vision and complements the character of the neighborhood. And secondly, to potentially consolidate to a modern and centrally located government facility that provides excellent service, can inspire a greater exchange of ideas, and enhances community spirit. So after the purchase of the site, the city kicked off a multi-year planning process to guide its redevelopment. And we began with the vision plan to understand the community's hopes and vision. And this will serve as the foundation for the next step, the area plan where we are now, which will guide development of the site and to guide development on the site and potential change in the nearby area. So just an overview of the site. This consists of several properties and buildings, and these include the main hospital, the medical pavilion, the Brenton building, a parking garage with commercial uses, and then 2 vacant properties on North Street. And in the vision plan process, staff recommended that the hospital is not suited for reuse and received direction to focus its efforts on the analysis to reuse the medical pavilion, which we'll hear more about later tonight. So the vision plan focuses on the site and also addresses the importance of integrating new development into the fabric and life of nearby neighborhoods and businesses. And in this process, we explore the community's hopes and vision in multiple engagement opportunities and concluded the process with the acceptance of the vision plan in June of 2017. The vision plan includes a set of guiding principles, and these are supported by strategies and performance criteria that offer means and methods to achieve the community's vision for the site. And these will be the basis for the area plan. So Leslie talked about what an area plan is, and just to provide some specifics about what this area plan will do, it will outline the desired character and scale, mix of land uses, and so on. It will create a common understanding of the desired changes in the area, define the characteristics in the area that should be preserved or enhanced. This plan will include implementation methods, and it will also include more detailed planning for the city-owned site. The project purpose statement reflects how the city will approach this project. It's a way to define the problem as described in our engagement strategic framework. Planning Board helped shape this with us last month in December, and we also brought it to the community for feedback. It includes aspects of the vision statement in addition to key outcomes of the area planning process. And this full statement is also on page 10 of your packet, if you'd like to review that further. So planning for Alpine Balsam will occur on a series of different scales. This is an inclusive process that will include the broader community, as well as people nearby and in the surrounding area. The lines that you see here on the map can be adjusted. These are not set in stone at this point. And I'll walk through the different layers here. So the first one, the area of focus, is within the blue line that you see there, indicated by number 1. And it circumscribes about 70 acres and includes mostly mixed-use areas and higher density residential, as well as a portion of North Boulder Park that is currently having some flood mitigation planning around it. This area of focus also includes the 8.8 acre city-owned site that you see there in blue as well, for which more detailed planning will occur. The recommendations and the implementation of the area plan will focus on this area and will address land use, urban design, access management, and transportation connections, as well as identify public improvements such as streets, parking, et cetera. So coming out a little bit further, the planning area shown by number 2 in the gray line includes approximately a 1/4 mile radius around the city-owned site. And these are areas that may influence or be affected by what happens in this area of focus. And then going out a bit further to the Broadway corridor, which you see there in pink, and number 3, we'll be coordinating closely with planning efforts along the corridor regarding transportation, as well as regarding the activity centers along the corridor, including the Civic Area East Bookend and the Ireson Broadway site. Yeah.
Broadway corridor, how far south does that extend?
So for the full framework, that goes down even further to Uni Hill, but we'll have more close coordination with this project to the Civic Area East Bookend. Yep.
How, Uni Hill is not discussed in this too much, so how is that, how do you envision Uni Hill kind of eventually interweaving with this part of the
Right.
plan? Or do you? Because, I mean, as you know, we're continuing to meet in not only the residential Uni Hill group, but also the commercial. And that meeting is on Thursday, and I'd like to know if I'm asked.
Well, this is part of the Central Broadway framework, and that is another hub within, activity center within the Central Broadway framework. And so, as Caitlin said, it won't be the primary focus, but connections to and interrelationship and tracking of what's happening in the Uni Hill site and how it can relate to what's happening in the Alpine Balsam site will certainly be part of the conversation.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that dialogue is maintained.
Absolutely. All right, so I'll now discuss 7 key considerations that this area plan will address, and these come out of the exploration of challenges and trade-offs and opportunities that were identified in the vision planning process, as well as more recent work that has happened since then. So a consideration of land use trade-offs for the Alpine Balsam site will be necessary to ensure development feasibility while working towards the vision for a mix of uses. Housing, as we know, is an identified community need and is also identified as a top priority in the vision planning process. The area plan will also seek to understand how the redevelopment on the Alpine Balsam site can further support the flood mitigation work for Upper Goose Creek. And it will consider the relationship of the rest of the city-owned site to these existing buildings on the site. And furthermore, transportation connections along the Broadway corridor, advancements in mobility and access will affect parking on the site, and this in turn will affect what's possible in terms of site design. We'll also be working closely with people and groups in the nearby neighborhoods to ensure that changes in the area are compatible with and contribute to these nearby neighborhoods. And the conclusion of the area planning process is timed to align with when the main hospital will be vacated so that redevelopment can begin in an efficient time frame after that point. So this is an 18-month process. It consists of 3 main phases, and each of these phases has opportunities for engagement. There's a lot of detail on that in pages 35 to 36 of your packet. So I'll just hit a few points on the first phase. We'll be engaging in site scenario modeling for the Alpine Balsam site, further understanding the potential and the desire for change in the planning area, and performing accompanying studies, among other things. So now turn it over to Jean to talk about engagement.
Caitlin, before you do that, could you go a little bit more into the phasing that you spoke about briefly when you talked about deconstruction and future phasing? Could you outline a little bit about what's being envisioned there, please?
So you're speaking of after the vacation of
That's
the
right. Yeah,
hospital
if you
from
go
the
back
site?
a couple slides. That one, the
want me to speak-
phasing
do
in
you
of
want me
the
to speak to that?
implementation, if you could just.
Yeah, so just wanted to speak to that a little bit. That is part of what we'll be discussing through the planning process. Amanda Beavis in the next portion will be talking about financing and partnership strategy being discussed concurrently with the area planning process. So at this point, we're still working through how this might be funded. We need to work with the community about what they want to see on the site. And so we don't really have a specific answer to that yet, but that is something that we will be working through the process. We're timing the area planning process to be complete when we expect BCH to be vacating the site, so that we will be in preparation to move forward with whatever comes out of that strategy and the process that we work with the community on.
Okay, so you're anticipating phased implementation, but what that exactly that looks like is yet to be determined.
Exactly. It'll be determined through the process.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so we are very excited, as are many community members, to get working on the really meaty part of the engagement of this project. As you know, this project was identified early on as a 2018 pilot to focus resources and help test our approaches and try new things as we roll out our engagement strategic framework. On the engagement decision-making wheel, we're rounding the corner on step 3, which is create an engagement plan, the draft that you see in your packet. And this draft was informed by our recently adopted framework and a lot of pre-engagement assessment work that was done in the last quarter of 2017. So we did a number of things to both inform community members about the upcoming planning process and gather information about how people really want to be engaged and how to get information. And we asked them about their thoughts on what would make this a successful process. Our team talked to dozens of people at the What's Up Boulder open house, as well as several other open events. And we also did an online questionnaire that had over 200 community members respond. We learned a lot from people, and we are acutely aware that there's a lot of interest in this project from community members. So all of that information, our engagement framework, and what we learned from these early and other processes that have been successful, helped inform the plan's objectives that you see here: clarity, transparency, inclusivity, and innovation. And we're not just tossing out these words because we think that they're cool. We think we've got a lot more detail about what we mean by these and what the promise to the community is in the engagement plan and how we intend to achieve these. So specifically, the next steps, we have engagement events and tools that are planned over the next few months that respond directly to ensuring that people have the information they need about the process and offer a wide range of opportunities for members to be highly involved or less involved, depending on their level of interest. As Leslie mentioned, the engagement is well beyond the lines on the map. We know that the nearby neighbors are keenly interested in participating in every step of this process, but we also know that many community members throughout the community are interested in all of the opportunities on this site. The engagement plan is designed to accommodate all of these. We intend to work with our engagement consultants to design each event and each tool to meet the objectives and ensure that the feedback from the community informs the decisions and informs the next steps, and also the key questions that Caitlin described for next steps of the process. So,
Oops. Great. Well, thank you. That concludes part 1. Now we'll be entering the council discussion item. These are the questions that we'd like feedback on specifically from you. Does council have feedback on the objectives for area planning that Leslie Ellis described previously and that are in your memo on page 4 to 5? And does council have feedback on the approach to Alpine Balsam area planning, including the purpose statement, scope, key considerations, planning area, and the engagement and communications plan? Thank you.
Okay, let's jump right in. Okay, nobody's jumping in. Okay, I have a question. Oh, well, okay. So I am curious about the relationship between Alpine Balsam and the Iris site, and specifically coordination with the county. And a bunch of us went to tour the hub in Longmont, which was very, I thought, a pretty compelling, interesting visit to see what that could, what was happening there. And I don't know if that's, the right model for here, but I guess one of my questions is my understanding is the county's doing their facility needs plan too, and we're doing ours. And I guess the question of what it might look like to co-locate, I guess I want to know how thoroughly are we going to, how are we going to tackle that? What's that going to look like? And are we really going to dive creatively into that? Or are we going to, is it a matter of co-location versus creating something together kind of, I guess. I saw a little bit of that. I didn't see a lot about that. So I'm just curious. Yep.
Suzanne, would you or someone describe a little bit what the hub is in Longmont that you just were?
Sure. I can just, it is a, and now I'm going to butcher this. It is a large building that has co-located I think it's owned by the county, but it's in coordination with the city, or maybe it's owned by the city. Does anybody know that? But it's co-located a bunch of the agencies so that you can walk in and as a citizen, as a resident, and get human services and well, I think it's mostly focused on human services, but it's all in one building. And
Both county and city, or?
yes, you're going to say it better.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how much city stuff there was. They had the motor vehicle registrations there as well. So
That
it's
was the
like,
only thing.
Yeah, so that is primarily human services focused, but with some other county offices as well. And there was a shared services model and an innovative layout and customer service approach where there are these multiple conference rooms where you could go in and schedule one and meet with one person there. And then if there was a follow-up need, meet with another social services provider, the same place. They had nonprofits co-located as well. So it's a way for residents to get a variety of county services in one place in a kind of innovative, interactive way. There's childcare available, there's child facilities available. It was really inspiring, honestly. And so to piggyback on what you were saying, to me, it seemed like a huge opportunity to take that model and then add in city services as well, so that to really co-locate many different kinds of things, a one-stop shop, but not just one-stop shop in the sense of, well, first you go here and then you go over there, which is not too far away, and then you go over there, which is not too far in there, but that you could actually get people who are coordinating together on our side, on the government side, and meeting with people. So they didn't have to go to many, many different agencies.
Well, just one other thought.
That's helpful. Thank you.
That it would lend itself, I think, Health and Human Services is an example where we do overlap with the county in the city. So that, for example, would be we haven't decided which departments would be there, for example, but if we were going to do that, that would lend itself to this vision.
So I can answer that just briefly, and you will have more opportunities to talk about that and be creative together. But the county and the city are both working on their city facilities needs studies, and the county has mostly completed theirs, and they've identified a range of mix of uses that they might locate either on Iris or Broadway site, or possibly co-locate on the Alpine Balsam site, if that's something we're interested in. It could range from a low, medium, high kind of scenario and different mixes. And so we'll be looking at that with them as we move forward. You'll have an opportunity at your lunch in a couple of weeks to learn more about the hub and ask questions and dive into that just a little bit, and then we'll loop back with you on the city, and the county will be having their conversations as well. But we anticipate coming forward through the spring with some different options based on some of those conversations.
The lunch, the city-county lunch.
Yes, January 30th, I believe it is. Is that right, Jane? Yeah.
Well, so let's exhaust this
I
topic.
just have a question.
On this one?
Yeah, and so if this discussion, this partnership between the county and the city moves forward, do you envision a signed IGA or something so that it's very clear who's doing what, and so everybody is very clear in terms of what the agreement is? And I don't want to belabor the point. I can go into some other examples, but I'll just leave it at that. That it's very, anyway, I'm just wondering, are we going to have a signed IGA and where the details are worked out?
not soon, but
Right.
ultimately, there definitely would be a signed agreement of some sort to set forth the obligations of each party and the financial obligations as well. So we have had partnerships with the county with regard to buildings in the past, and we've learned a lot of things from that, and so have they, and so we would want to take those lessons learned.
Yeah, and that's good, and I just think we need to be very clear. So
Absolutely.
I think it's good we're going in this direction.
So I just wanted to add one more thought to that, which is, I don't know that we know that this site is the place to do this, but I guess what I wanted to do is make sure that we are actually having, as we're visioning and having robust discussions, that this is in play. We may not, may choose ultimately one way or the other, but I also think that this has, my understanding is, it has very much implications for the site on Iris. So to the extent that I think these are very linked, and they're sort of linked in the area of focus planning, the three different sort of looks. But I guess to me, what we do on one I think will directly affect the availability of the other. So I guess to me, it's a little stronger of a connection if we're serious about exploring. So I guess I just want to say, without predisposing the answer, I would like us to robustly explore. And I think that involves having maybe some participation of the county at some future things that we're planning, so that, again,
It does, and I don't want to put words in the county's mouth. They can talk to you on the 30th, but they have been thinking about how they might approach the planning on that site and how that might dovetail with the work that we're doing. And so those conversations are definitely taking place, but I don't know that we have all the answers just yet.
Okay.
And just to reinforce that and what I said before, I'm glad you're having those discussions, because I think we do have a really enormous opportunity here to partner with the county and put together something that could be really innovative and help our residents to obtain county services and city services. So I just really encourage you to be robust about those discussions. Yeah.
Anything else on this one? And then, yeah.
Are you guys taking RFPs before a lot of the civic engagement so that they can then see them, or after? And then also, are we going to do multiple builders and designs like in Holiday?
We don't know yet, is the short answer. As I mentioned before, we're sort of at the beginning of this process. We do anticipate looking at different partnership opportunities, what that might look like. If we issue an RFP, is it for the whole site? Is it for a portion of the site? There are still a lot of unanswered questions, in part because we don't have a plan for what should be happening on that site yet. We're at the beginning of that process, but we recognize the importance of understanding that along the way. And so we'll be having those conversations early and often as we are working with the community on what should happen on that site. So not at this time, but we will stay tuned in terms of what direction we will be going on that.
Mary?
So first of all, thank you for the presentation. And full disclosure, I live in the neighborhood. So my question is going to be about, as part of the area plan, do you foresee conducting some sort of a baseline? What is the situation on the ground right now in terms of things like parking and traffic, and because it is at the moment quite challenging, and so I just want to make sure that we know what it is at the baseline so that we go into it knowing that.
Yes, that's definitely going to be part of the analysis that we're doing in the coming months, so, yep.
And is that going to be part of the outreach, or is it just going to be like looking at the numbers?
So I think what we're envisioning is that when we have that kickoff meeting in either late February or early March, that we're really sharing with the community a lot of that baseline data, key topics, key information, that so that everybody's on the same page, so that it helps shape the trade-off discussions, the issue discussions, and all of the rest of the key questions that we'll all need to answer together as we move forward.
Just a little bit of feedback. One of the things that if you're going to be asking questions while you do the outreach of people, maybe also survey the people that are parking in the neighborhoods, because we see a lot of folks that park in the neighborhood, pull out a bike from their trunk, and are likely riding downtown. So it would be nice to know how much of the impacts of downtown might be moving north into neighborhoods.
Cindy?
I don't know where this is particularly in the process, whether it's part one or not, but I'd really like to see emphasis on transportation on the front end, sort of what Mary was referring to, but really, particularly if it goes from Iris up to Uni Hill, that it's not just a segmented piece. And later in the memo on page 31, you talk about connectors, but they're for pedestrians and bicycles. And I think that looking at transportation, people are not going to be out of their cars, much as we might like that, but also some kind of transit that is, more robust is a great planning word, more robust than it is now. So that is really looked at as an underlying piece of all of this on the front end, the parking, as Mary was saying, and those impacts of people driving their cars places in the neighborhoods and taking out bicycles, I think probably happens all over, close to the downtown. So, but those kinds of things, but specifically the Broadway corridor and transportation means there.
Just a thought on timing. So the lease runs out at I guess the end of May, right, with the hospital. And so we have our timeline, our area plan adoption mid-2019. And I just want to really say that I feel like we should be ready when the hospital is done. I'd hate to see the hospital leave and then 6 months go by without anything further happening. I think we have a good amount of time here. So I think we should make sure that our schedule is designed such that we can move forward once the hospital is finished. As part of why I was asking about the phased implementation, because I look forward to hearing more about that later, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean that everything is decided and ready to go, but that we know what the next step is after the hospital's gone. And that there's for a few reasons. I mean, part of it's the carrying costs, as we all know about, but partly too the vitality of that area when the hospital goes away. There's going to be a real hole in terms of the number of people who are going to the local businesses and such. And so I think we want to make sure we're moving on a regular schedule.
So I know we're kind of popcorning around, and maybe that's fine. I want to understand the relationship of this planning process with the call that we're going to discuss at our retreat about a central Broadway sub-community plan, and how those might mesh or feed or happen at the same time, or I don't know if this is, well, at least can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so we haven't done all the analysis for this evening to talk about the pros and cons and issues and that kind of thing of what it would take to do a sub-community plan or a corridor plan for this area simultaneously. And I think we'll have more conversation at the retreat so that you all can have that opportunity to prioritize and talk about objectives and that sort of thing. The area outside of the sub-community plan beyond what's designated as the area plan is largely residential, and I think we heard some input from you all last week about the issues being a bit different in those residential areas. And so I think if we were to move forward at the same time, we'd want to design a process that gets at the right kinds of issues and outcomes for that area and have you all help us define what that might be. And so it could be something that happens in parallel with this effort, but isn't necessarily bundled into this effort, so that there's obviously some synergy with the engagement that's happening simultaneously and that kind of thing. But I think we'd want to do the job of defining those issues and that problem statement and being clear about what we're trying to do as we do that on its own kind of planning process.
So following up on that, it seems to me like if we move forward with sub-community planning, the first piece will be defining what sub-community planning is and how it works. And that will take a certain amount of time, as well as staffing up to do the work. And so it seems like this Alpine Balsam plan process is going to move along faster than sub-community planning. So even if we launch a specific sub-community plan, at some point it might be a while. And so this may be better crystallized by the time anything like that would start. So I guess that's my thought, is even if we decide to go forward, it may not be as simultaneous as all that.
And I would just comment, coming from the North Boulder Subcommunity Plan, where we had our real area of change along North Broadway, and that's where the bulk of the work was done in North Boulder. But the subcommunity plan offered the opportunity to look at that wider and broader sub-community area and really fine-tune what were the needs or the expectations of the people who were living in that sub-community. So for example, we were able to identify transportation links. So we got a lot of bicycle corridors, ped connections. People didn't want roads, they wanted bike ped connections, so we got those. And also a great opportunity to look in North Boulder at the park system, and we were able to identify areas that were underserved and areas that really needed to be filled in. So from my perspective, I don't see the sub-area and sub-community as such a big distinction. I think the sub-area plan will really be the area that we focus into and really do a lot of the work, but I wouldn't shy away from the sub-community and area, because there may be some opportunities to fine-tune and to identify needs that are unmet at this point in time. One other comment I would have is that this central Boulder subcommunity is the largest subcommunity, I think, of all of ours in terms of population, and I think maybe even in terms of area, but you would know that better than I, Leslie, having done all those incredible fact sheets. You know, we may want to have a discussion about North Central, Central Central, and South Central. But I don't want to belabor the point, but I wouldn't I wouldn't encourage people to freak out too much about subcommunity, because there are opportunities there that don't take that much extra work. And in fact, you know, picking up all the baggage for the sub area, you might as well put on a backpack and do the sub-community. It's the same lift in some ways.
Yep.
You outlined priorities for the site. We've heard a lot about housing. I thought the vision plan so far looked so great, how you went from kind of lower density near the park to mixed use and higher density in commercial. But I am wondering, is there anything that we know for sure is definitely going to be like, these are going to be city offices? Or, you know, I'd love to see a teen center or a multicultural center as part of this. But other than housing and some mixed use and some commercial, are we going into this saying, hey, there's definitely going to be this, and we have to kind of figure that out and work around it?
I think, to answer your question, that portion would be maybe more focused around city facilities, as we've discussed, and we'll be talking more about later tonight. But in terms of getting more specific in the types of non-residential uses, et cetera, there hasn't been any clear definition around that just yet, and that's going to be actually what we're doing in the coming months. So we have... Yes, I mean, we heard a range throughout the vision planning process. There are some flavors of things, I'll say, that emerge at that point, but I think we want to explore that a bit further with the community. So like nonprofit uses, health-related uses, that kind of thing emerged in the vision planning process.
Just a follow-up question to that. I know you're probably not going to be really excited about answering this, but can you give us, to follow up on Jill's question, can you give us a approximate range? I mean, we're talking about 8.8 acres, and it sounds like some government offices will be there, maybe city and county. Are we talking 5%, 50%? Can you just kind of give us a general idea? I know there's a range there, and you don't want to pin yourself down, but can you give, just so we can kind of scope it in our heads?
So,
Oh, the hospital site.
So Michelle Crane will speak to that a little bit more in the next section, but just to let you know, we currently have the Brunton building, there's a parking garage. We're discussing the potential reuse of the medical pavilion. Those things combined take up between 25 and 30% of the property, including the site area work that would need to be done around it. So that's kind of the range that we're looking at this time.
Should we think of that 25 to 30% as a kind of a minimum? At a minimum, that'll be government offices. It could be more, or is that kind of like pretty much going to be it?
I think the rest of it will have to shape out through the area planning process. We are, as Michelle will speak to later, in the city facilities. There are city facilities that were called out as part of the civic area, city facility hub in the Alpine Balsam area. One of the reasons we're looking at these sites combined is as we're looking at those things, making sure that as decisions are made in one area that might influence the other area, we're able to respond to that. So I don't really have a good answer for you yet. We're kind of leaving it open to the area planning process.
Okay.
Okay. Cindy and Mary and Sam.
Following up on Bob's comment, it is 8.8 acres, but a lot of that land use is going to be predicated by flood mitigation, is it not? I mean, just generally speaking, without being exact, there is a big pond there when it rains, right where Alpine goes into 9th. It gets bigger depending on the amount.
Oh, right. So about of the larger parcel at 1100 Balsam, so the parcel that the hospital is on.
Caitlin, can I just ask you to speak up into your mic,
sorry,
please?
it's not coming through? Okay. So the larger parcel that the hospital is on, about 50% of that is in the 100-year floodplain. And there is current flood mitigation planning happening on Upper Goose Creek, looking at a range of things. And part of that would potentially involve some work in North Boulder Park, potential detention. But I think the outcomes of that, yes, it would affect to some degree what could happen on the site. We heard a lot through the vision planning process about an interest in a green corridor pulling through the site and that potentially playing a role in that. But that's, I think, still kind of being looked at in this flood mitigation planning. But in terms of the 100-year floodplain, there's, per our regulations and our code, there's a lot that can still happen within that, but there are some uses that would not be able to fall within that. Just critical facilities, things of that nature. But only the upper corners of the site are affected by things like the high hazard conveyance. So those would be obviously not having structures in them.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Caitlin, that some flood mitigation would be considered in North Boulder Park. I guess I was under the impression that it already is a detention pond. It isn't?
I'm not full
because it certainly,
here,
when it rains a lot.
Right,
and
it effectively acts as such. But my understanding is that there would probably be more work around that to make it a little more official, I'll call it. But if anyone wants to jump in here on more specifics around flood planning, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing that. I was always under the impression that it was already a detention
and specifically, how will things be different if that happens? Like, what will have to take place and what will it look like
Sure, and a lot of that is part of the work that is happening in that mitigation planning study, which just recently kicked off also. I don't believe it's functioning
Can
as a
you
regional
introduce
detention
yourself?
facility right now.
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Edward Stafford, the Development Review Manager for Public Works, which also includes floodplain and wetland administration. So the mitigation study is looking at a variety of different concepts for that area, one of which is to have a larger regional detention facility in the park that would help downsize then the conveyance capacity needed in the channel as you go further down from there. I don't believe the park right now has been designed to act as any large detention facility to serve those needs, but that's part of what the mitigation study will look at. That will be handled also as a part of the area planning process here in conjunction, while not in the same project. There will be coordination amongst those. There will be some expertise also in the area planning process to look at the flood mitigation and flood impacts as it relates specifically to this parcel.
Can I?
Yeah.
And Edward, thank you, that was helpful. Will you also be considering road infrastructure like on 9th Street where it really does get flooded when you have a heavy pour, 9th and Balsam, that area?
I'd have to look at the mitigation planning. I don't know that it will look to any heavy degree at some of those smaller street conveyance areas. It's usually looking larger at the channel itself and what's needed through there, whereas a lot of the street conveyance becomes our minor stormwater. I think some of that has been looked at in the master plan for stormwater, and I don't know what the prioritization in that area is.
Yeah, it's just that, what I've noticed is that it really ponds there, and it just seems like if you're in there looking at it, you might as well get the whole thing fixed.
And some of that is, as we get into actual implementation of redevelopment in this area, things we could be looking at in the infrastructure design also.
Okay, thank you.
So, a follow-up to my own question. If the park, North Boulder Park, were to be used as a regional detention center, does that mean that there's the possibility that there might be some excavation that happens in the green areas?
Yes, if it was to be utilized as a detention facility, there could be excavation and or berming that would have to be done in order to create that impoundment area to hold those waters back and release them in a slower manner. That's part of what will have to be analyzed in the mitigation study and will have to be discussed with a variety of community and resource boards, of course, as to what those impacts would be and whether that's something that's the community wants to see.
They won't. Oh, sorry.
So I had another
keep going.
different question.
Oh, well,
after.
does anybody else got any on the flood detention stuff? Okay, keep going.
So I have a question about boundaries of the planning area, the focus area. And I notice for the planning area, some of the boundaries go along streets. And when a boundary on a planning area is shown to be going down a street, does that mean that one side is in the planning area, one side of the street is in the planning area, and the other side of the street isn't in the planning area? Or how's that handled?
So are you referring specifically, Mary, to number 2 up there, the planning area or the area?
Yeah,
Right.
number 2 and specifically 14th Street, because it looks like it goes down 14th Street, and then, so I'm wondering if it goes down a street, is one side of the street in the planning area and the other side isn't?
Right.
So,
Can I follow up on that? It's funny, so on the west side, you're going down alleys, which seems to make more sense to me from a planning perspective. And usually when you look at like uses, you don't do it, you don't separate on the street, you do it, behind the house. So that is a big concern because you want like uses on either side of the street. It's just basic good planning principles. So,
Right. Yeah, so yes, it is absolutely basic and good planning principles to cross streets. I think with respect to the planning area, around those edges, we're not necessarily foreseeing land use changes.
Right.
And so you wouldn't have that kind of scenario where you'd be changing something on one side and not on the other.
right, but just based
Right.
on good planning, it
Sure.
seems to me that maybe you want to go in the back of these units instead of along streets.
Yep.
Just- And I get it that these are residential and most stuff won't be happening, but again, one of the things, we have so many people, as you've all explained, so many people are really excited. We also have an opportunity to educate our public on good planning principles as well. So we should do that in this process.
We have a
Back to my question.
Sorry.
So the reason I'm asking that is I understand that there aren't any land use changes planned. However, there are other issues such as the traffic and parking and things like that that affect two sides of a street just as equally. And so I want to make sure that those kinds of concerns are addressed, that you're not cutting off one side of the street where they're seeing the same kinds of impacts.
Right, and I think I would also add that as we were commenting earlier, these lines aren't really set in stone at this point, and I also see the planning area as it's not as much of a rigid line. I know it appears as such, but in this process and as we're working with neighborhoods, again, it's not going to be so boxed in that way. It's how people identify in their neighborhoods and what kind of interests we hear. That can be a bit flexible in terms of that area what the outcomes of that would address. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You done? Sam?
Yeah, I'm done.
So my question has to do with the shopping centers across the street. So those are clearly in the planning area, but the impacts of uses, people who use those shopping centers are in a much bigger radius than that. And so how are you going to be addressing exactly the shopping center uses? Because those are likely to change over 20 years, 30 years, who knows what the timeline is. But I'm just curious how you think about that, because when I think about sub-community planning, it's obvious that you would want to talk to the community about what they would like to see eventually there. It might be what's there now. Maybe it's something different. But for the Alpine Balsam site, you're not going to be having that kind of a conversation, right? You're going to be having a conversation which is just about how will the change in Alpine Balsam affect those sites. So talk to me a little bit about how you approach the shopping centers.
Right, so the area of focus within that, it's also about understanding the potential for and desire for change within that blue line. And so as part of that, we want to be having conversations with those property owners in that area, including the non-residential property owners, and understanding, we're operating on a 15-year timeline roughly. So understanding what their plans are and their desires are for that type of change. So we know that those shopping areas are very dear to the nearby residents, and it's a very important cornerstone of that area and this broader radius. And so with this site redeveloping, that does have impacts in the nearby area. So it's basically starting off with conversations with those property owners and understanding the role and importance of these shopping centers, and then with this vision for this vibrant mix of uses, what relationship they would have together.
Kind of piggyback on that one. In the focus area, that area where the Boulder Medical Center is, I believe that's BT2. Is that correct? Where I'm going with this is that
I'm just looking at the zoning map right now. It is BT2.
What is, yeah, okay, so, and BT2 is the same zoning that Baseline 0 is, and how the uses on BT2 weren't quite compatible with, in that particular, in Baseline 0's case, weren't quite compatible with the neighborhood and allowed more things that were kind of incompatible. And I guess I would like to make sure that as part of this process, we examine that particular zone and make sure that we don't encounter the same issue in the future as happened at Baseline 0.
Well, and I'll just throw that on. I do think context is important, and I'm glad that these lines aren't in stone and are rigid. I mean, we're cutting the park in half, for example. So if you're going to dig up half the park, like you can't, to me, that makes no sense. because obviously the park as a whole, it's an amenity, it's important, and what you do to one end affects the integrity of the whole park. So I don't have to fuss over the lines, but to me, it would be a big circle. Because context, I think, matters. And I also think that not only is this the shopping center, to piggyback on what Sam and Mary are saying, is important, it's actually an important part of town, right? It's important to the entire city. This is one of those nodes of activity, and North Boulder Park is more than just the pocket park. And so anyhow, I guess if we're going to do something dramatic and creative, that we are not talking enough about that fun, creative stuff, but in the middle of this, we're going to affect this important node in town, and I guess to me that's a big circle. And it's along a really important corridor. And so anyhow, I guess I want to me this isn't like, let's figure out a little time, yeah. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I like that idea of a circle. And that when you're talking about the 15-year planning horizon, I think of one of the ways to approach sub-community planning and area planning is areas of change and areas of stability. And so like we talk about those shopping centers as they are absolutely beloved shopping centers, right? And they're different from other strip malls around the town or around the country. And so, that might be one of those things to be like, here are areas of potential change, say, for example, some of west of Broadway, some of the buildings with bigger parking lots that are older that, maybe good opportunities for redevelopment in 15 years versus, say, those two shopping centers, which are probably areas of stability and would not change in the next 15 years. So it could be a really helpful part of the process.
I just want to ditto both of what you're saying. I think it's really important as well not to narrow that focus too much, but look at the wider impacts. Because I know if one were to do an analysis of who shops and goes to that shopping center, it's pretty wide, pretty broadly through the community, and particularly central Boulder, the older parts there.
And go ahead.
I just want to point out that the conversation we're having now is why I believe that if we get this done, this planning process done, that if you do a good job at it, you've pretty much done with it for the sub-community plan as well, right? You don't have to have the conversation again. So one of the reasons why I'm interested in this being an area where we do a sub-community plan soon is because we'll have done all this work, the transportation corridor study, Iris and Broadway, and this, if you get through the conversation, which includes a huge area of change, right? And possibly the shopping centers as well, then that's a whole bunch of work you don't have to do again through the sub-community planning process, because you can say to the community, look, we engaged you really vigorously on this important area of change, and we don't have to go through that same process again. We'll say this one's done. And so I just want to point out that there's a synergy here with all the work that's going on in this area of change in this sub-community, and being able to get through a sub-community planning process quickly.
And my last point, which might get into sub-community planning, is just that the neighborhood right next to the park, well, and just to the north, is still market rate affordable. It's a pocket. And whatever we do here is going to really affect that. And so as we figure out, I don't know, we're going to do something amazing and it's going to have ripples. And I guess I want us to have looked at the larger context to try to plan for how we want to manage those ripples, both the good ones and maybe the ones that we wish wouldn't happen. But that's another thing on my list, is that's kind of a cool, funky neighborhood that is in danger of being scraped. But it provides a lot of really good market rate affordable right now. So anyhow, we can't ignore that, even if that's not what we're focused on, but that is a likely outcome. So I'll just throw that into the mix as a concern I have in the back of my head.
Well, I'll just comment, it's already happening.
Yes, I know.
And we've experienced a ton of scrapes and a pretty big change in the character of the houses that are right on Balsam. So, and it is moving to the north. So it's something I just want to support Suzanne in that.
Excuse me, if I could interrupt a minute, I just want to do a time check. We're about 10 minutes out from the time that we originally said we would start part 2. It's of course your prerogative on when we start that, but wanted to make sure that you're covering everything that you wanted to cover.
I think we are, but why don't you throw up the scope, the things, the specifics that you really wanted us to make sure we liked?
Oh. We can look at the questions.
Well, no, you talked about the scope, the purpose. Anyhow, I think we've been covering.
One of the areas that has not been covered yet is the objectives.
Okay.
And I'm getting there, the planning objectives. And again, these are on 2 slides, so I can flip when you're ready.
That one looks pretty straightforward, hard to disagree.
Okay.
How about the second page? I would add, but, oh, go ahead. I guess the part that we haven't talked about, but I want to make sure, is there's a lot of energy and excitement about creating something cool on the redeveloped, the empty lots right now. And I guess it's maybe not quite that, the fact we have a chance to create something pretty amazing, whether it's how we, create the city offices or the hub, or just make some really cool housing on that site. But anyhow, that opportunity to be creative and kind of walk our talk in terms of amazing city planning and stuff, I don't see that captured in there, but maybe it goes without saying. But I guess I would just underscore that this is a really, really cool opportunity to do something, a little legacy project here in the middle of our city. So,
Yeah, can I say, I think that would be great to have in there words like creativity and innovation and legacy, and so things that are beautiful. I mean, there's some aspirational wording that could come in here that I think reflects some of the community's hopes for this site.
Just let me pile in. We call out number 6, city facilities, and it was helpful to know what our minimum amount is. I don't think specifically call out housing, and we don't specifically call out what Zan and Aaron, I was getting there, call out the cool factor or the community factor. And I guess the question is, which way do we want to go? I mean, do we want to say city? I don't want to presume the public process, so I get that. But if we all sit around this table think there's going to be some housing there, then why don't we just kind of call a spade a spade? We can talk about the type and the size and the location and pricing and all that kind of stuff. But if we all think that housing is going to be an objective of some sort within the site, why wouldn't we call it out just like we call it city facilities, and then take it a step further? Why would we not call out this cool community thing, whatever it is going to be, as an objective as well?
So I'd like to make a point of clarification. These objectives really are intended to span both the East Bookend site and the Alpine Balsam. So these are really objectives for the Central Broadway major planning initiatives that will be happening over the next year. As the context, I know we're focusing on Alpine Balsam tonight, and they certainly apply there, but these objectives are intended to span both. As Caitlin went through her presentation, she had what we called, in that sense, key considerations, a little verb, term change. And in those key considerations for Alpine, housing was definitely identified as one of those key considerations. So just a point of clarification, this is supposed to span both.
Well, the aspirational creative factor, I think, very much applies to the East Bookend.
Correct,
And
yeah.
Yeah, we're going to, whatever gets there is whatever's going to be built there is going to be beautiful, right? I think we all talked about that before, yeah.
Well, but I'll just say, I mean, you do have a couple things about this goes in Alpine Balsam, this goes in the civic area. I mean, it does mention city facilities. I mean, housing is a critical piece of the Alpine Balsam.
And I didn't mean to dissuade from that. I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point.
We have some other people, and we're going to, I know Cindy's in the queue with another thought.
It was basically following up with what you and Bob have been talking about over on that side. So I would just ditto that again. Just,
Okay.
yeah. Opportunity.
So this brings up the question that has been rattling around in my head about this particular project, Alpine Balsam. How do we keep it from becoming a Christmas tree? So, you know, there's a term called blivet, and blivet is essentially 10 pounds in a 5-pound sack. And so we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to sort through and prioritize? Because if you put a whole bunch of different things there in order to satisfy the Christmas tree ornament desire, then you end up with a hodgepodge, I'll call it. But we'd like blivet better. So anyhow, I would just ask for your thoughts briefly on how to make it not a blivet, but a beautiful project.
And again, we'll touch on this a little bit more later, but you're hitting on exactly why we want to have the financial and partnership conversation in tandem with the area planning process. We will be going through looking at different options, different trade-offs through the planning process, but those options and trade-offs aren't only about the different land uses and activities that might occur on the site, but also about how eventually we might be able to implement those. And so if you have the Christmas tree effect, if you say, as you say, of everything, that gets challenging to implement at the end of the day. And likewise, we will be going through, as Caitlin said, the phasing process, as you kind of see on that handout. We will be starting with various conceptual options, but working with the community on those trade-offs, sort of narrowing it down throughout the process to eventually get to a preferred alternative. But that will be a lot of trade-off conversations with the community.
Right, and I think that's fantastic, and I also think pointing it out up front that there's a lot of aspirations and projections onto this site that people want, and that it will probably be very difficult to get all of them. So part of the process will be prioritizing, and that means that some constituencies may be disappointed.
On the Make It Beautiful theme, once we've gone through the planning process and established what the community wants there and what fits best, does the building code, is it going to be the same process that we have now and all the same regulation, or are we thinking about relaxing, maybe doing form-based code, maybe specifying styles or material uses, or hey, you can actually do some dormers here even if they float into the, you know, sometimes we think it's going to be beautiful and then it's just a box. and some of that's our fault, our process in our code.
So I think the type of design guidance that we have in this area plan kind of remains to be determined as we work through it. So it could be a range of things, like it's a design guidelines or something beyond that, like what you're describing. So I think that's going to emerge through the process.
Wait, can you just sum that up? That yes, we can be creative?
Yes, we can be creative. I was just speaking about the types of design guidance that would come out of this process, and that remains to be determined.
Okay. Anything else? Is there anything else that you feel like we didn't respond to?
Just if there's anything else about the process as we move forward that you'd like to make sure that you hit on. I think this has been really terrific feedback. Otherwise, we just want to make sure that we set out in a direction that meets your objectives.
I'd just comment on Bob's comment about housing kind of being not in this list. And I think when we acquired the property, we made the point that it was part of it was for housing. So whether that happens or not, I think we need to be really clear with people and with the public, and so.
And I will underscore, my understanding from the county is that the site on Iris, which is also, could be their county facility up there, or could be housing, and that also, to me, is an interesting conversation to have as we look at the whole and what would serve us. On the process stuff, I think we're doing good process. And as long as we get to, in the things that are coming next about the facilities and figuring out what should go where, and also creative financing, I think those are two things I was going to call out in the public process that I think we definitely want public input into. The trade-off conversations and also, but anyhow, if we're going to talk about those in a minute, I won't talk about them now, but to me, they're relevant to the public process piece. So.
This is kind of a question, I guess, I don't know if it's for Sarah or Jean. To what extent, if any, do you want us to be involved in the public engagement? Because I know we're shifting our public engagement process and council's trying to be more visible in certain ways. Do you want us to kind of stay out of your way and you collect it and give it to us, or do you want us to be involved?
We would love an inclusive process. So I think that's up to you. We're trying to design events that are going to be really exciting and creative, and we'd love to have you all participate in those. So I think it's to the degree that you would like to be involved. That's always awesome. When we did a lot of the comprehensive plan meetings, I think it was really useful to have council members and planning board members and other board members at the events to firsthand hear folks' thoughts, concerns, ideas. So I think we welcome that.
Okay, shall we move to the part two?
Great. Thanks. We're going to switch some staff up here.
Yep, there you go. That was cool.
Should we begin?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Good evening. Whoops.
But y'all, just speak up.
Yes. Michelle Crane, City Facilities Design and Construction Manager. I work with our Facility and Asset Management Group. It's been a great conversation so far and a lot applicable to what we'll talk about now. So FAM has been working alongside the Alpine Balsam team as they develop the vision plan for the Alpine Balsam site. Our focus has been on conducting a city facilities assessment, and our two key objectives have been to develop a vision and guiding principle for city facilities and also to form a recommendation on an organizational concept for consolidating city services between the civic area East Bookend and the Alpine Balsam site. We did provide an update to council last February on some of that work. In the civic area, we had envisioned this as a place for civic engagement and community discourse, and this is very much in line with what the first guiding principle of the civic area master plan. So the types of services we would see here are city council, city manager's office, city attorney, those types of services. At Alpine Balsam for city facilities, we envision this as a centralized hub for customer service. So key priorities and strategies with that would be to prioritize the customer experience, clear, easy ways, welcoming entries, lobbies, easy access to information, variety of ways to access information. To promote active community engagement, so having flexible, adaptable, multifunctional meeting space at the ground floor, transparent and permeable. And then, again, to really emphasize providing welcoming and inspiring spaces. So showcasing information in public spaces, city initiatives, community accomplishments, those sorts of things at the ground floor. So the other thing that FAM has been focusing on is just looking at the existing conditions at the Alpine Balsam site and what portion of that should be retained for city services and what buildings. So as we mentioned, the Brenton building is currently undergoing renovation, and that's planned to be completed in the spring. We're using the parking structure for satellite parking for city staff currently and sharing it still with BCH at the moment.
Can I jump in there? I have a question on parking, a little off point. There was discussion some time ago about sharing some of that unused parking with downtown employees once the city employee take rate was known. Is that still on the plan? Because there's a lot of empty spaces there, and there's a lot of people who would love to park who will work downtown?
So I think Michelle knows the answer.
Yeah, so we are working in collaboration with them, but when we complete renovation of the Brenton building, we're going to be moving close to 80 employees up there.
Okay.
And we continue to promote it as a satellite parking, so I think we will see more parking utilization. So we've been a little hesitant to basically give away spaces at the moment until we know what's going to park up there.
Can I just ask you some numbers? How many spots do we, I know that the hospital has employees. How many spots do we have?
I'd have to come
200
back
and something?
It was half, and we recently negotiated more spaces.
So call it in the zone of 200-ish?
Yeah, I think more than
Okay.
that.
What's the total?
400, I think.
I believe 400 and, 411.
And how many, I know that we're going to move 80 employees up there, but how many employees park there right now?
I'd have to look back at the numbers. We were kind of calculating that on an average monthly basis, but I'd want to confirm.
Okay, does
some of those.
20 sound like it in the zip code?
Probably in the zip code, yeah.
Okay, so if we had 20 plus 80 is 100, we still have a lot of empty spaces there?
Yeah, so it's something I think we'll continue
Okay.
to
I just
look at.
want to make a
Yeah.
point of it because this has been talked about for quite a long time. We have a lot of downtown employees who would actually park there. And so it's kind of a shame when we have a parking problem downtown and we have dozens and dozens of unused parking spaces 4 or 5 blocks away.
Well, yeah, and just to tag on that, we have had some issues with employees who work late at night, and, the cost of parking for them, these people are those who are serving you in your restaurant, doing dishes, things like that. And so I think because of right now, some of our downtown garages are so expensive, it's very difficult for some of our employees to park in our city-owned parking lots because of the rates. And
So can I interrupt for a minute? We are working on a new plan.
Oh, good.
I've been talking with Mary about this for a while that would provide a very, very substantially reduced rate for evening employees. I know that Mary Ann and Molly are going to be talking about that in the next week. So we knew that they did a pilot over the summer that was not successful, and my view is that it wasn't successful because the rate was not low enough, and so we're going to lower it to a rate that we can try to make it more successful. And we would prefer for them to park downtown because late at night it's closer, right, than this facility is. And then getting back to this particular facility, Molly is also working with the downtown to understand what their needs are, and we also have the surface parking lot that someday won't be a surface parking lot, but in the interim, we're trying to designate which part of it the city can use to work with the downtown as possible parking spaces. So Michelle and Molly will work with Molly Winter and report back to you on that information.
And Jane, that's music to my ears, so thank you. And I was thinking that, they would still be able to be downtown.
Okay, everybody, let's get back to the presentation.
No, I just want to make one comment about this.
I know, but
real quickly.
Don't do that again.
I just wanted to just reiterate that why it would be important to survey the people that are parking in the area to know what the impacts are. And it goes to this.
Yeah, I think those are all good points.
And I also wanted to say neighborhoods and west of 9th Street, anyone up there on any of those streets, they are bumper to bumper through the week. And people up there, even though they're neighborhood parking plans. So it's a big impact. Anyone that could be moved off, I'd be greatly in favor of.
Even if
In the
temporarily.
interim, even as an interim.
Keep going.
Okay, we will continue to work on that, though. So as Caitlin had mentioned, we had recommended back in November 2016 to deconstruct the hospital. And so the focus tonight is on the Pavilion building, which is what is now highlighted in blue on the plan up there. So you had asked earlier, at this time, the city is looking at preserving roughly 30%, which is about 2.5 acres of the site, out of the 8.8 for city facilities. It is what we've currently identified as part of that assessment as the need, which leaves the rest of that site available to other uses. So it also accomplishes consolidating facilities to this location of the site, which is some things that we had heard through community engagement last year.
Do you have a square footage for that?
For the city facilities
Yeah, you
need?
said it 2 point, yeah. If you don't, you don't.
It's roughly 2.5 acres, which includes sort of site development in there. For the city facilities, we looked at around 120 to 150,000 square feet. So just zooming in onto the hospital itself, so one thing I want to point out, as we look at the medical pavilion, it is physically attached to the hospital. And the yellow line here shows that actual connection of the pavilion to the hospital building. So when we look at deconstructing the hospital, essentially what you see here on this 3D, the yellow here represents sort of the areas that essentially would not have walls and would have to be reconstructed. So while this does kind of present a challenge as far as the timing of deconstructing the hospital moving forward, it really is an opportunity as we see it to create a vibrant plaza on that side, to re-envision those facades that now have to be redeveloped in alignment with the Alpine Balsam vision plan. So last year, city staff engaged a consultant, Studio Trope, to conduct the reuse analysis. And our purpose was to evaluate the reuse potential of the medical office pavilion relative to the vision and the goals for the Alpine Balsam site. Our approach was to develop a conceptual reuse design based on consolidating customer service-oriented city functions, and then to evaluate that concept for constructability, meeting regulatory requirements, and then also meeting the vision for city facilities and the Alpine Balsam site. We then estimated the construction costs of that reuse, and we compared that to a comparable new replacement building to see where we would land. So our findings from this analysis as it relates to the context and the site. We actually felt that reuse did contribute to the Alpine Balsam site. We thought we could create some really vibrant places for community gathering in these plazas left behind or open spaces. We felt it respected the site's physical environment. We actually thought we could preserve more mature vegetation through reuse than through redevelopment. We thought that this would serve as a model of sustainability, and we could provide some innovative design solutions in that renovation. As it relates to the surroundings and the site, the pavilion is right now developed in such a way it relates very well to existing grades, which are a bit challenging as Alpine and Broadway come together. And we didn't really think that a new building would be able to respond much better. It provides good connections through the site, so many of the gestures of bringing streets through and providing greenways were actually could be preserved as we reuse the pavilion. And you could maintain a basement and existing utility connections. As far as the building itself, it's actually a really well-constructed building. It's concrete. We likely would not get quite as well of a constructed building with a new building. It is an office building, and so it adapts well to those types of uses. It has a core elements such as bathrooms and elevators that are in the right location. Its proportions are good for reuse, we think we could provide some really engaging spaces on the ground floor. As far as the size of it, we actually discovered that the floor, the top floor, was structured to add an additional floor. So if we wanted to, that could be achieved within the 55-foot height limit. And we could expand the building once the hospital was down if we wanted to achieve desired program goals. We did an energy analysis on the building, and the real key takeaway here when we looked at embodied energy is that reuse was the least energy intensive and preserved the most embodied energy, even over just keeping the building as is. We would look at replacing systems to meet our current energy codes and need to do that, but again, the key thing is reuse would preserve the most embodied energy. So after developing essentially this conceptual building, we went and got some construction costs for the reuse and then compared that to essentially the same replacement building of the same size and configuration. And we found that reuse would likely cost us, in this scenario, about roughly $8 million less than in a replacement building. And following up on just the deconstruction aspects of the hospital, we did also estimate the cost of deconstructing the hospital, and that has been estimated between $6 and $7 million. This still doesn't include hazmat abatement, which we're still quantifying. And so we'll be addressing that through our regular CIP process this year. So our conclusion really is that the pavilion is very well suited for reuse and should be renovated to consolidate city services. So at this point, we're suggesting moving from a reuse analysis, which really looked at feasibility of the pavilion, and moving to a renovation analysis. And we would anticipate really involving the community and staff engagements in this to inform the program and the synergies and what should go in that building and how that should be developed. We would also want to do more analysis of what we're calling the city site, so the relationships of buildings that would be preserved, and create that little city cluster of buildings. Do some more regulatory analysis, and then develop more detailed cost estimates based on that kind of actual renovation project. And this would all be accompanied by a financing strategy, which I will let Amanda talk to now.
Thank you, Michelle. All right. So we've been talking, my name's Amanda Beavis, a project coordinator in Public Works. We've been talking to you a lot tonight about our planning efforts and our intent to move forward on those planning projects. To the extent that it applies to those projects, a key factor that we'll be looking at is the understanding the budget, financing, and partnership opportunities involved in those planning efforts. To get at some of the questions earlier tonight about phasing, we're looking at this from a near-term and a long-term perspective. As Michelle was alluding to earlier, we will be evaluating the hospital deconstruction and the medical pavilion renovation costs during the 2019 operating and CIP budget development. So you'll be hearing more about that this season. And when we talk about long-term, that really means through the area planning process over the next year to year and a half. We'll be looking at developing a strategy that addresses the implementation of the area plans. That includes the Alpine Balsam site, the civic area East Bookend, and the medical pavilion renovation. We're looking at this as 3 potential funding options that includes on the screen and in your packet the redevelopment of city-owned land, the development of city facilities, and any infrastructure investment or support of other community benefits in the remainder of those planning areas. So keeping in mind the order of magnitude, as Michelle just talked about, the medical pavilion reuse analysis suggested a cost of $42 million that will need to be revisited as we go into a renovation project. But as we think about the proportionality of this financing strategy, that's where we're starting from, and a lot of questions to be answered through the area planning process. And to figure this out, knowing from some of the comments earlier tonight, something that we've been considering as well is how to address this financing strategy, knowing that we will want to consider the community perceptions and their values, the city's continued stewardship towards public resources, and our unique position as a property owner in these cases, as well as the market feasibility of implementing these plans. So as you all are aware, the city has multiple funding priorities on the horizon. As Councilmember Weaver suggested earlier, there's something to consider with a 10-pound need in a 5-pound bucket. And so part of that is to look at all of the tools in our toolbox. On the screen is just an example of some of the things that we'll be considering. Knowing that we're far too early in the process to take anything off or add anything onto the table, this just gives you an idea of some of the things to generate revenue towards implementing these plans.
as we move forward through the area plan, we look forward to working with you with the community, as this is a good opportunity to incorporate this into the area planning process. Speaking a little more towards phasing, as you'll see on this screen and in your packet, this follows the familiar graphic that's also a handout in front of you that follow the financing and partnership strategy will follow the same methodology as the Alpine Balsam and East Bookend area planning process. And the intent with this is to move from research and analysis to development in the same manner that the area plans will do. As you may have questions, we will be happy to answer those, but first, Molly will wrap up with some next steps.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So to recap what some of the other presenters have stated previously, the city staff will move forward with the coordination of the Central Broadway area planning for both the Alpine Balsam area and the Civic Area East Bookend sites, continue planning for city facilities and services in these areas, and develop an associated financing and partnership strategy over the next year. You'll be seeing an information packet in late January on existing conditions in the East Bookend, which will be the basis for launching area planning process and community engagement for that planning area. The East Bookend planning will be synchronized with the Alpine Balsam area planning phases and timeline, and we will have check-ins with council to get feedback from you at key phases along the way, with a goal of plan adoption in 2019. So with that, that concludes our part 2. We have, it looks like, about 25 minutes for council conversation. The questions we are asking is, do you have feedback on the medical pavilion reuse analysis and the renovation next steps? And do you have feedback on the suggested approach to develop a financial and partnership strategy in tandem with the area planning processes?
Okay, let's do the first one first. Yes.
I'm curious, since with the pavilion, if there is reuse and rebuilding there, and there is the, this is going to be anathema, I'm sure, for some to hear, but since there is the possibility of building another floor, will you be looking at the costs of that, feasibility costs?
Of specifically building that floor? Mm-hmm. The actual cost that we presented included building that floor. So we made that baseline assumption and could back off of that. I think as we go through the process with the Alpine Balsam area planning process and community engagement, we'll further refine that. But those costs actually included that additional floor.
That additional floor. That might be a nice place for the penthouse housing.
Wait, you're done. No. Okay, Aaron?
So, pardon me if you said this earlier and I missed it. What's the status of the city's facilities study?
Well, we've conducted a city facilities assessment, a first phase, which is still in a draft, but it informed essentially at a high level which departments might go in the civic area, as I'd mentioned, and which we would recommend consolidating at Alpine Balsam. Working with the two area planning processes, the civic area and in Alpine Balsam, to a point Molly made earlier, there may be some balancing as we look at what fits in one place and another, and trade-off. And so it's really kind of a working document in order to help inform those two processes.
So you've gotten the first phase, a high level done, but you still need some more detailed exploration.
As we start to learn more about each of those sites, we'll get into more, and the pavilion reuse or the renovation analysis will actually help us get into that at the, with regard to the pavilion and the Alpine Balsam site. So we'll start looking more deeply at those services that would consolidate there, what would fit, and what makes sense in, in keeping with the vision that we described for that site.
Okay. Well, if I could offer feedback then on the medical pavilion, I'm thrilled that the reuse situation comes out so favorably. I mean, I'm really glad to see us being able to reuse some of the hospital sites. So that's great. And I really like some of the vision that you sketched for it. I do want to be careful, though, about predetermining the outcome here, because we're embarking on an area planning process. And we've taken the Brenton building and said, okay, those are city facilities, and that's one piece, and that's fine. But while it's clear that this building is well suited to office functions, I think we can peg city facilities as a good candidate. But I think we really should do the area planning process before we say this absolutely is a city building. Because, I mean, potentially nonprofits could be in there too. If we work with the county, that could be a combined facility, or maybe that's a different one somewhere else. So anyways, I would ask us to not predetermine too much. So I think preserving it, fantastic. Do the renovation analysis, but let's still keep the door open to exactly what uses might go in there. Does that sound good to people?
Yeah, well said. Yeah, well said. If you want the public to participate, don't predetermine it.
I also, yes to that, and yay, reuse. I'm just going to put a plug in for us being a model as we deconstruct to have a great recycling and reuse program for those materials. I think that the city, we have great policies, but they are not always implemented, and it'd be great to show everybody just how good that could be. Yeah.
And before we do start deconstructing, I would reach out to different partners in the community that do that and focus on that, so maybe they can help guide how you go about doing that.
Did I see a hand?
With the city offices being here, is there, I guess I've never really understood this site for city offices. I'm sorry. And it especially with how many employees live out of the city and how central this location is. And is there something in moving city offices there that really benefits us or the community? Does it consolidate offices and make it more operations more efficient? Does it allow more, community engagement? I just struggle a little with this site.
So one reason why we actually purchased the site was to consolidate. And so right now we have services spread out across about 14 different buildings. It's hard for our community members to find different services, and many times they'll go access something in one place and then they've got some other piece of business and they're trying to find their way to another location. A couple things that consolidation accomplishes up here is we are also leasing space at a decent cost. And so consolidating helps us get out of lease space. It brings our services together and can create a better way, just like it was described with the hub. I think, we have similar goals of serving the community and providing these great spaces. We also can look at realizing some goals in the civic area master plan, of which was to deconstruct Park Central and New Britain, which are in the high hazard floodplain. And so centralizing and consolidating in that location would help us achieve those kinds of goals and become more efficient. We realize it might be ideal to centralize down here in the civic area, but there's also a lot of, uses, again, to go back to the 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. We don't want to put everything here. So that's where we did look at how do we split but still be really efficient in how we centralize in 2 locations, and how do we develop a concept around it that makes sense and makes sense to the community about where they go to engage and to have discourse, where do they go to get city services.
I just want to get a big picture on the outlay. I know that there's a potential to monetize some of the property as well, but just on the expense side of things. So we bought the property for $40 million, right? Rough, just using round numbers, and the renovation, including adding a floor to the pavilion building, is round numbers about $40 million, right? So that's about $80 million. And we spent, how much did we spend on the Breton building renovation?
8.
So we're kind of in the zip code of $90 million for these city offices before we start monetizing stuff to the west. Is that right? Big picture, roughly $90 million in? Okay, thanks.
So on the financing piece, anything else on the pavilion piece? And we already held forth on parking, and do we need to say anything else about the parking? Obviously, that's a hot button. I guess I'll just underscore on the parking thing, that even if things are temporary for 6 months doing this, or it's still 6 months of relief. So anyhow, But it sounds like discussions are happening. On the financing, I guess, I'm glad that all the options on the table. I do think that we were, I'm not an expert on financing, but people talk to us about creative ways that people in the community could also invest in things like public buildings or the housing piece or whatever. And I guess I just encourage us as we look at the options to also not be afraid to look at some of those creative options that some of our colleagues are doing in other cities. And again, that's not my area of expertise, but I hear a lot of interesting ideas as I'm out and about that seems like, we should at least discuss and see if they would be appropriate for pieces of this. Because I think there's a lot of interest in the community in being, I just keep saying being creative, but being innovative, maybe that's a better word, about how we approach this, so that we don't limit ourselves too much.
Absolutely.
Other thoughts on financing? Okay, well, thanks so much. I mean,
Thank you.
yeah, this is going to be a really fun part of the next 2 years.
Actually, so just one more thought on the financing. It is important as we do the area plan that have at least a little bit of a test fit with financial resources, right? I mean, I think we probably know that we can't develop the whole site on our own at a premium level just with city funding, right? So that those constraints, we don't know exactly what they are. We don't know exactly what the financial mechanisms would be, so it makes it a little tough. But just make sure that we don't ignore our financial constraints as we're going through the planning process.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you. This is great. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Okay, and then part 2 of this evening will be broadband, but I'm going to go get dessert while we're waiting. I don't know where I put that.
So we do not have a quorum, so we'll just wait for a little while.
You got the techie guys here. We're all chomping at the bit.
Emphasis on guys, right? There's 3 of us on council, 3 of us here.
Entire male component of the city council.
Coming back, don't worry.
Mary's pretty techie, too.
We have a quorum. All right. Sorry to keep everybody waiting. Take it away.
You ready for us?
We are ready for you.
Okay.
Broadband.
Thank you for having us this evening to talk about broadband. I'm Julia Richmond. I'm the Chief Innovation and Analytics Officer for the City of Boulder. I'm also the interim CIO for the city. I'm joined by Chris Meschek, the Assistant City Manager. We are recently onboarded to this project, and so we're going to talk you through sort of what we've done to date and really get a sense from you. Our goal of the meeting today is to really get a sense from you about the process that we're taking to explore broadband in our community, less so the mechanics of broadband delivery and much more about are we on the right track with regard to the steps we've taken to date and our plans for the future. So I'll move forward. So we'll give you a little bit of a background about broadband in general, recognizing we have some new council members and this may be a new topic to you. We'll also talk about sort of the project vision and guiding principles in general, our scope to date, the phasing and our approach to community engagement, and then we'll round that out with some questions to you on the topic. Okay, so just wanting to get everybody level set on the concept of broadband. Broadband can kind of broadly be understood as internet, high-speed internet. There are 4 ways that you can deliver broadband services, and what we want to talk about with you today is really focused on fiber services, so data and light sent over glass fibers. We have made an investment in the city in wireless technologies over the past couple of years, and so we have moved forward with that, but the focus of the conversation today is really around fiber specifically. We wanted to set the context for what we're talking about when we're talking about high-speed internet. And, you know, everyone uses the internet regularly. If you have access to it, it's pretty much a human right at this point. It is something you need to thrive, to learn, to gain knowledge, and to access your community in many ways. And we wanted to set the context for you about sort of what the internet looks like today, because it's moving and changing really fast. So thinking about 2016, last year, or 2 years ago now, welcome to 2018, we started to study parts of our community. And so some statistics up here reflect both the Boulder community specifically, but also kind of global trends around the internet. So we see in our studies to date that there are selective services to parts of our community. So maybe you live in one of those and you have spotty or low-speed internet, inconsistent internet access. We also know that about 2 to 4% of our population in Boulder have access to no internet at all. So that's not, you know, spotty internet, that's no access. We also know that in many of the sort of mobile home or manufactured home communities, the internet is hard to come by and people are using you know, little MiFi personal devices and things like that. And if you've ever used one of those, it's maddening. So that may not constitute high-speed internet in any way. We also saw last year the rescindance of net neutrality by the FCC. In 2015, that was advanced, so it's a relatively new concept, but was also rescinded last year. So the rules of the game have changed as recently as last year. Some things to think about just in terms of 2016. Speeds in the internet were about 27.5 megabits per second, and the monthly per capita gigabit usage was about 13 gigs. Mobile devices constituted 50% of internet traffic, and we averaged about 8 connected devices per person. In total, about 15 billion devices connected to the internet. About half of those were mobile devices, and then, you know, a quarter of those were other. And why this becomes as important is when we start to look at where we're going with regard to the internet. I'm going to start with the bottom half of the slide, where it says by 2021, because that really sets up the context for the top half of the slide. So we recognize, and the industry is showing that the internet will double in speed in the next 5 years.
that the usage by an individual will almost triple, and that mobile devices will actually remain fairly consistent in terms of their proportion of the internet traffic. Further, we're going to move from 8 connected devices to 13 connected devices, so again, nearly double that. And if you think about what that means, it's your home, your Nest, your doorbell, the thing on your chicken coop that prevents it from, burning down because you've now got a sensor on it in the winter if it gets too hot. Lots of different types of devices and tools are now connected to the internet. And we start to see how that plays out when we move from 15 billion devices to 30 billion devices globally. It's an insanely fast growth in use of the internet. And the interesting thing is we start to move from 7 billion mobile devices to 8 over the course of 5 years, but we almost quadruple the amount of other types of devices. So what this means is that there's going to be an incredible demand for internet services in a way that is rapidly accelerating. And as a community, being prepared for that is pretty important. So you hear sometimes
8 billion in the city of Boulder?
No, globally.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah,
Okay,
that would be a lot of
all
devices.
Of these facts are...
Yes, where it says in 2016 and by 2021, this is global rates. Yes, sorry, thank you for asking that question.
So follow up on that, the first bullets on each of those categories, the available speeds. When you say available speeds, are you talking about average speeds, and if so, in which geographies?
It's available, so that's as fast as it can go. And so that would be, yes, it is the average available speed.
Average available, is that U.S.?
Yes.
U.S., okay.
Yeah.
And Boulder's roughly comparable?
Yes. So this all to just set the context of the internet's really important and that it's changing much more quickly than some of the other commodities in our community. This is changing more quickly than roads, than water, than other things that we provide kind of in a mass scale. So with that, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about kind of our project history to date. So the world is changing quickly, and so is our project. In 2014, the voters exempted Boulder from Senate Bill 152, which basically limited our ability to explore telecommunications as a utility, excuse me. And that, again, was a vote of the people. It passed by more than 80%, so it's tremendously popular in our community. In 2015 and 2016, we spent a lot of time investing in wireless expansion, and we conducted a fiber feasibility study to understand sort of what broadband could look like in our community. We then, over the course of last year, began to explore what partnership options could look like for that fiber, and thought about that because we had available options in some vendor partners who were interested in both meeting our goals and constraints, and also we're looking at the opportunity to really build out in Boulder. So that brings us to where we are today, which is really in the process of refining our goals and objectives and moving into the discussion with you all. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julia. So as we talk about the project vision and we reflect on kind of where we've been, and that the landscape, as Julia mentioned, is evolving, and our landscape related to partners potentially has evolved as well, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But the project vision, as it was stated back in 2016, really is how do we provide a world-class community telecommunications infrastructure? And really that connectivity, and recognizing that connectivity is really, as Julia set the stage for, kind of essential going forward. And so how do we now think about that everyone should be able to have that opportunity and have that availability, and that really it's becoming almost an essential service, just like roads or water is, and it's one of those foundational items that we need in the community, or thinking about kind of broadband almost as essentially an urban service for the community. And so guiding principles were developed for the project back in 2016 with the assistance of the Broadband Working Group and Council. And as we noted in the May 2017 information packet memo, that some refinements to these principles may be necessary based on latest changes in the marketplace. And these principles are the idea is that these will be able to help us in guiding our evaluation of our options. They aren't criteria, but they're really principles to help frame the conversation. So we've refined the principles a little bit to include now from 4 to 6. So the first is about citywide access. So that's about really infrastructure and access for everyone in the community. And the second is equitable and inclusive, that really we should make sure that it's for everyone and that it isn't cherry picking or providing maybe infrastructure in a community, part of the community where subscriber rates may be higher than others. The next is about future oriented. And the idea is really, how do we make sure we meet the long-term needs of our community, while also recognizing that right now there are things around 4G densification that are occurring, future 5G wireless, which is super fast wireless connectivity. So how do we make sure we build an infrastructure that would be ready for those future evolutions in the market? The next one is about a competitive marketplace, and this guiding principle is unchanged from what it was before. But really, how do we make sure that we facilitate a marketplace in the community that is competitive as reasonably possible, really for the benefit of our residents and consumers in the community? And then unfettered access is really about the principles of net neutrality. How do we make sure that there aren't data caps or there aren't kind of those potentials that we've read about in the newspaper about pay to play or throttling, that sort of thing. And then the last is about open access, and that's how do we design infrastructure or a solution that could facilitate maybe even multiple partners utilizing that network.
Question there. Why is open access in here and as a consideration retail isn't in there?
Say that again.
Why do you have open access as one model? There's another model that Longmont, Chattanooga, Fort Collins are using, which is a retail, where the city becomes the complete ISP, the internet service provider.
Gotcha.
So why isn't that in here in this
I would say
list?
that is reflected in there, and I'm actually going to specifically address that as a little bit here further in the presentation.
Okay. Great.
So there's some key areas for project exploration that we've identified, and that is really for the city to take steps to build out its fiber capacity. And if we do that, which model should we take? Should we look at a public-private partnership, or should we look at a public build-out? And then along with that, the other key issue is how should we fund that effort? So the project scope reflects that same kind of two areas. First is about the infrastructure for a broadband fiber network, and then the second is related to the financing options and approaches to pay for that. I do want to note that for the analysis of the project so far, we've not assumed that the city, at least at the outset, would be the provider of kind of the retail internet or be the internet service provider, that we would lease the fiber network to one or more providers. And depending on the arrangement that we set up, we may or may not be able to preclude that. But I'm going to specifically dive into this a little bit more and address your question that you're asking, Lisa.
Lisa, let's just let them present. We're going to have a robust discussion,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
I'm going to specifically address the city being an ISP. So we've also heard some comments and questions about the relationship or interrelationship of broadband to municipalization. And so there are some synergies as well as some differences between the two. But ultimately, we do see them as two distinct efforts. There's 4 areas that I wanted to dive into a little bit. The first is related to the construction or building process. During the construction process of broadband, the vast majority of the way the infrastructure would be installed is underground through a boring process, where you're boring conduit into the ground and then pulling fiber through it. There could be a chance that there's some areas where we may need to do some work if we were to start an electric utility as a part of that separation process, where that work would occur in the same spot. If that's the case, we would obviously want to coordinate that work. But other areas of the city, we may just be doing that underground work. The other benefit that could be there if we had our own electric utility would be related to the aerial portions in the city, where the electric utility is above ground and other communications infrastructure is above ground. there's a process of what's called pole attachments, or making those poles available for our fiber. If we owned those poles, we'd only have to ask permission to ourselves to attach to those rather than another utility. So there is a benefit there. The other piece is related to, over time, there would be undergrounding of the electric utility if we were to have that. The timing, and I'll get to that at the end here, is a factor related to broadband.
Just a quick technical question. Can you bundle electric and fiber together in the same trench? Are there any obstacles to that?
It depends on what kind of electric and what kind of fiber is my very basic knowledge, but we can get more detailed information to answer that. Related to the financing, based on what we know today, financing for broadband and for municipalization would require separate revenue sources due to Tabor, as well as some of the debt capacity and revenue requirements. So we also recognize that funding a broadband network would potentially be a significant amount of money. Funding the startup of our municipal electric utility is also a significant amount of money, so there is that factor that's floating out there. Related to operating, there are some similar customer service center needs between both an electric utility and a broadband service, but actual system maintenance operations are really different businesses between the two. And then last is timing. So build out of a broadband network could take the city about 2 to 4 years once we have that funding in place. And depending on if we move forward to a ballot item this November, we could actually be well under construction before we know exactly what will happen with our municipal electric utility. But all of that now said, let's say we were to do both. That doesn't mean that in the future, once both have started up and are going, that we couldn't connect those two from a operational or service provision standpoint, and we could have them function together. So it doesn't close the door on that in the future. So now diving into where are we headed over this next year. So previously, we've done the feasibility analysis. What that feasibility analysis has told us is that full build out of a broadband network is somewhere between $100 and $140 million throughout the entire community. And there's some different approaches. So at this point, what we're working on now under phase 1 is refining that network design as well as what's called a backbone design, kind of what's the core part to make a whole system work. And so we have consultants doing that, as well as refining the cost estimates. They're working on that right now. And we're here at this January study session check-in. Where we're headed next then is developing and analyzing the different options and approaches, re-engaging if there's any potential partners out there, and then we're aiming for a March or spring city council meeting. So with that, what really are the options that we're looking at? And all the options are on the table at this point. No options are off the table based on how the landscape has changed related to the partners that are out there. We want to look at all the different options. These are in no particular order. The previous direction that we had heard from council was to focus on the partnership option, but as I mentioned, that landscape's changed, so it's time to step back. So the first option is obviously do nothing, let the market grow at whatever rate the market wants to grow at, providing broadband services in the community. The partnership option is to look and see if there's a viable partner for the city to work with. The next option is a fiber-only option, city build fiber-only. And that's one where we would build the fiber network, and then we would lease it through negotiated agreements with one or more internet service providers. So this is sometimes referred to as a wholesale model or a dark fiber model. So if you read the previous reports, you'll see those words in it. The last option is a city build fiber plus an ISP. So this is similar to that previous option I described, except that the city of Boulder would be one of the internet service providers to be able to provide internet service. In other words, we would start an internet service provider business. Now, an important note to that is that we haven't done the detailed business case analysis for starting up that business. So if council is interested in that option, it'd be helpful to hear that tonight so that we can initiate that business case analysis so that we have that information available for the March and June upcoming meetings. So as I mentioned, we're targeting that March or spring city council meeting to check in on the options analysis, see where we're at. And then through June, we would work on refining the options, work on what's the preferred option, and then bring that forward to council here for a June public hearing where we would make a decision on whether to proceed with a ballot item and select an option. If we do that, then we would work on preparing an item for the ballot through that August and September timeframe. So that's where we're headed, and we'll be looking for thoughts and feedback on if this is the right approach and timeline. You saw a graphic very similar to this in the Alpine Balsam presentation just before us. And all this does is it shows the 9 steps to good engagement related to the phases of this project. And I'll dive into that in a little bit more detail here. The broadband project is a pilot for the city's engagement framework that we discussed back in November. And we've developed 5 principles for how we want to do engagement for broadband. The first is related to raising awareness. So tactics that we might use for this are things like informational sessions, materials, newsletters, videos, social media, that sort of thing. The second is to tap into the technical and financing expertise within the community. So we have a wealth of expertise in the community and really smart folks. And so we want to be able to tap into that. And whether that's through some sort of a working group or panels, we want to be able to leverage that experience. Third.
For what input?
To help us make sure that our analysis covers all the different aspects, that we're not missing anything, to really help make sure that we're doing the best work that we can do. Thank you. So the third engagement principle is about reaching audiences that are feeling the impacts of the digital divide, is kind of the term. So trying to understand what are the areas of our community that lack internet access. We hear anecdotal stories about whether it's in mobile home parks or even school kids that struggle to get their homework done because of internet access. So being able to really reach those audiences through our community partners to have some one-on-one conversations and then collect some stories to be able to really make sure that everyone understands that my internet service might be a little bit different than your internet service, that sort of thing. The next principle is about effectively assessing public opinion. And so this one's really important, I think, as we go forward if we want to make a decision on whether to put something on the ballot for this year, is to really understand where the community's at. We hear a lot of support for broadband, and it's not if we should do it, it's really how we should do it. Should we partner? Should we not partner? How much is this going to cost? What does it really mean for me as a person in the community? So we'd like to do some statistically valid polling, either by mail or by phone, to be able to assess that, to really help us have a good foundation to help guide what a decision would be as we move forward into June. And then lastly is about modeling the city's engagement framework. As I mentioned, this is a pilot project, so we really want to make sure that we model the framework that has now been adopted. So with that, here are the questions that we've posed for helping frame the discussion tonight. The first is about revisions to the purpose, vision, and objectives. The second is, does council agree with the project scope and phasing in order to consider a 2018 ballot item? And then lastly, any feedback on the draft engagement and communications plan. So with that, we're happy to answer questions.
Let's start with questions, and then we'll dive into some of the meat. Sam, Lisa, Cindy.
So I'd like to hear, pardon me, from Bob Icahn about the full bonding capacity of Boulder, because one of the discussions we had during the muni, financial impacts spoke to that a little bit. So I'd love to hear from Bob on just the thoughts of doing one or both, or the order of doing them from a financing perspective.
Thank you, Sam. It's a great question because right now we have many unknowns in both areas. If we were talking about municipalization and talking about broadband. We've talked, I'm going to get back up and give a little background because these large projects like this, we always have the problem up front, the first year before we have revenues to start flow in. We had it with Boulder Junction. We've talked about it when we talk about the hotel, combination of hotel parking garage. We've always got that gap that we have to cover. In the municipalization, in the electric utility, once we own that utility, we have the right to issue revenue bonds. And therefore, we have a stream of revenue that can pay for that. Now, if we have costs before that, we have to figure out how to pay for those. Same way with broadband. And there is a big difference. Broadband, we will not be a monopoly in broadband. We will be a monopoly, and we are in water and wastewater and storm drainage. We will be in electric utility. We'll have 100% of the customers. We will not have that in broadband. You hit 35, 40% is great. Longmont, 53%, wonderful. But you aren't going to have 100%. So we have to cover those capital costs up front. And as we've talked before, we have to have a revenue source for that. And that's why the concern, and we have to know more about municipalization costs. We need to know more about broadband's costs, when they're going to happen. Because let's just say that we've got the amount of money that we think we know we're going to have to issue with this electric utility. We already talked about that. We're going to issue that debt. We're going to pay for it. Now we've got these costs before that. We have to figure out how to pay for that. Now, if we have a broadband that has to come in with $100 to $140 million, we put that with the electric utility, and now the debt service, we've got coverage problems for that capital that we're going to need to build later on in the later years, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth year in capital. So when Chris was saying I would say 5-7 years from now, yes, they could merge and we'd have revenue sources to cover it. We'll know what the costs are going to be. But here at first, we have to go very carefully. Can we merge them right now? It doesn't look like it with what we're seeing at this time, but we need more analytical work done.
What was the verb you used? Can we merge?
Yeah, put them together.
Yeah.
Yes, eventually.
So another question. When we passed our Muni vote in 2011, that was to fund the groundwork for deciding if a Muni made sense, right? It was doing the prep, and we'll get to the end of it and say yes or no. So it was a funding source for essentially the feasibility studies and really learning about it. Is that the kind of thinking that you're doing for what would be on the 2018 ballot? That it would be a funding source for understanding the full costs? Because I don't.
Broadband.
For broadband, yeah. Is that it? Or are you envisioning 2018 measure that would authorize the broadband itself? What's the thinking that you got?
I'm going to let Chris go first for his thinking, and then I can fill in.
Great.
What we're thinking for broadband is actually it would be to go on the ballot would be the revenue source as well as the debt authorization to build the network. So it'd be going to move forward to build it and create that broadband network. So it would be a new revenue source to cover the debt service of whatever that cost would be. Right now, it's somewhere between 100 and 140 million, depending on which option we choose. It could be less than that. But that's the work that we're working on now.
So in the case of we have a full financial business model that's totally fleshed out. And that was what we required before we would say something like, yes, go ahead and build it. Now there's other regulatory things in there. But from a financial perspective, we had said we need to know the full costs and have the business model totally tweaked out before we go to voters for approval of the actual project. So what's the difference in thinking here between this and the Muni?
I think some of the differences are, obviously it depends on which option we decide to go forward on. If we go forward with that city build fiber only, we're building infrastructure, and then we'd be working with someone who would actually light that fiber and provide retail internet service. So we would be in the ownership of infrastructure. There isn't a lot of additional business analysis necessary.
Well,
if we decide to provide.
Can I stop you right there? It seems to me like there is business analysis required because will the lease rates be attractive to the ISPs? Will it be enough to cover the full-on debt service requirements? So it seems like either way, there's a business model that has to get validated, and it has to be validated pretty thoroughly if we're going to be responsible about this. And so a question I would have is, do you think in your timeline, we're picking options further down the line, I don't know, April, May kind of timeframe, and we pick an option, will you be able to have a full business model to us by September?
So that the dark fiber model, or that kind of this city build fiber only model, that business case analysis for that has already been completed. What we haven't done is if the city were to enter in as the internet service provider like Longmont has done, and Fort Collins is exploring, that's the more detailed work that we haven't done. We have it at a very high level, but not enough that we should rely on it for decision making. We'd want to dive in and do more of that. So that's the sort of
But you could do it by September?
Yes, we think we can at this point.
So another question. You say the business model's been validated for the dark fiber model. When we talk about the Muni, there's a spreadsheet, the financial forecasting tool that's online that any citizen can go open up and play with the assumptions and look at what that does to the business case. Do you have something like that available for the dark fiber model?
You want me to talk to that?
I'll let Bob dive into it a little bit more. To be the exact same as that, as the tool that we have for municipalization, no, it's not to that same extent. It is tables and spreadsheets in a document that's been prepared.
And those models are ones that I've been working with as the consultants put them together. There's been a lot of communication back and forth on the models we were looking at previously. So those models are pretty robust. It's now the ones we haven't completely finished, or we want to look at saying adding the city as an ISP. What is that going to add in operating costs up front? What type of operating expenses and those things are what need to be added. Eventually, yes, you will have that. You will have a model. It's not as huge as municipalization because there aren't as many moving parts, but there's enough.
So I'll just close with, I think it would be valuable for citizens to look, I do it with the financial forecasting tool, to be able to have some insight into what the sensitivities are. So that if you couldn't get this lease rate and it was like that, then what's the impact to the debt service coverage? I'd like to look at the models and say, where did they break? If startup costs are above X, the Muni doesn't make financial sense. And it would be interesting to be able to do something similar with broadband because it's of similar interest level to the community and it's got similar risks.
Okay.
I just have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
In terms of there's the parallels between the two, but is it fair to say that the broadband case is a fair amount simpler in terms of the variables and the moving parts than the municipal electric utility?
Yes, I would say that financially, definitely.
And I would believe that. And I would say all the more reason to have such a tool up because it's not that much work.
So we're still doing questions. We have quite a queue. Lisa, Cindy, Aaron, Mary.
So my question is, how, in what time frame could you complete the full model where the city follows a model, is the ISP provider? And so can you answer that?
Sure, there's that additional business case analysis for us to look at entering into the market as an internet service provider. That work will require some consultant support. depending on exactly how fast we initiate that work, we could have that work ideally by that March conversation. We may need to push that date out a little bit, but we'd definitely be able to have it before we'd make any kind of decision on the exact point to go forward in June.
And what's the rush here? I mean, why do we have to do something in 2018? Why wouldn't we want to be a little more conservative, be a little more confident in what we're doing, have those same tools that Sam just talked about available for the public? So in 2019, do you see a downside to going in 2019?
If the direction was to slow down, we could slow down.
Okay, so there would be a downside.
Yeah, where we've been on the project is doing a lot of analysis, and we do see that there's an urgency in how the market is evolving, and especially as Julia showed with a lot of those statistics, that's 2021 where those numbers were. And so the big risk of waiting is just we continue to be further and further behind.
Right. So to Bob, Sam asked about the bonding capacity, current bonding capacity for the city. And when we just finished with a discussion about the site, the Alpine Balsam site, and in order to acquire that site, we put $48 million into certificates of public participation. And basically, that means that we put most of our assets into that. Is that correct, or do I not follow that right?
We can set, there's two different ways to do them. If we did certificates of participation by the hospital. We did not use the buildings on that site because we didn't know who were going to use it. So if we have buildings that are left there, they can become assets we can use later. That's if we use certificates of participation. We would still have to break loose. $100 million is roughly $8 million a year for 20 years in principal and interest. So you have to have that source of revenue to make the payments each year, if it's $100 million. So if you can't break loose, if you have $100 million and you can't break loose $8 million out of your general fund, then you have to have a new revenue source of $8 billion or part of it to pay that annual debt service. So the two would be separate. Either way, we have to have a way to make the annual payments.
Well, for me, and I'm wondering if I can get this, and this is also linked with our last conversation, it seems like, we have bonding capacity for the electric utility. We have a lot of our assets right now tied up in certificates of participation. And I guess I would like to get a better understanding of where we are financially, even in this discussion that we just had. As Bob helped illuminate, we're still short $48 million, something like that. And so we have to come up with some other kind of revenue. And so before we go really any farther, it would be very, very helpful to understand how much in debt are we really getting the city into with this direction at this point in time. And I'll leave my comments till later.
Cindy.
I just had a question about the last slide in terms of the statistically accurate survey. What kinds of things you would be asking? Would you be including things such as the financial costs, the different alternatives, like the city being the ISP versus partnership type thing?
Yeah, I think it would be things that would give us information about, one, the pulse of the community, where they're at in terms of interest. And then two, I think it would be an opportunity to then test that if we estimate that it would cost, if the city were to build the whole thing, X millions of dollars, which would result in either a sales tax increase or a property tax increase or whatever financing mechanism, we could test those questions to see what level of support is out there for the community to tax themselves to support this. So that would help us to bring forward for council to make a decision about whether to move forward or not. So it would be some objective information to help in that decision-making process, as well as some market research.
Thank you.
The queue is Aaron, Mary, Bob, Jill, Zan.
So talking about the wholesale model, where we're, the dark fiber model, where we're bringing in partner, or we're having other people lease the fiber, right, to be ISPs, who would we anticipate might be, would we be soliciting bids? Would we be going out to people? What companies might we expect to do that?
I think we would definitely be soliciting bids for that. And it could be a wide range. It could be maybe some of the partners that we spoke to before. It theoretically could even be the current incumbents of Comcast or CenturyLink. And so I think there's options or opportunities for others to use it. There is also the potential in other communities. Some of like the cell phone providers have used it as part of the backhaul to their cell towers. So that could be Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, those sorts of things. So what exactly that would look like would have to be determined, I think, through a true bidding process.
So in other words, there could be revenue opportunities that aren't directly linked to providing fiber and service to people's homes, internet access to people's
Correct,
homes.
potentially. Right now, those providers are investing in a network already in the community. So whether they'd be interested in then utilizing this one is obviously a question, but that has occurred in other communities.
Yeah, and so that leads me to my next question, which is, what are some other examples of cities that have followed that model, and what kind of results are they seeing?
So we have some of that information. I will totally admit I don't remember all of those cities of the different models, but that's what we would bring back to you in March is examples of those cities. Different cities have had different levels of success, both in the wholesale model as well as in the ISP model of them providing. Some have been really successful out of it. Some of them are getting out of the business now because it didn't go so well. So being able to understand what was it that worked really well, what was it that didn't work well, so that we can know what's the right decision for our community.
And have we thought about something that's a little different than what you've talked about, which is, like you were saying, one of the principles was open access, meaning, hey, we'll lease it to anybody who has a decent business plan, is willing to meet our other criteria. And then there's the city as the full retail provider, right, where people are actually paying us for their internet access. Is there some model where we contract with a third party to light that fiber and provide the customer service to clients, to residents, that's a little different from what you're talking about?
Yeah, we could potentially do within that kind of the fiber-only model. Essentially, we still own the fiber network, but then we contract with a provider to provide that service. That definitely is an option within that.
And do you know if other cities have taken that kind of approach?
There are some cities that have taken that approach as well, and again, we can include those as case study examples.
Thank you.
It directly related?
Yeah, so my follow-up on Aaron's question is, can we set the rate of that lease to outside providers, or, and is that the revenue source that you're talking about?
Let me answer, but make sure I answer your question to make sure I understood it all. Yes, if we were to say partner with somebody who we were going to contract with to provide the internet service, negotiating what those rates would be for the consumer could be a part of that process. Then what essentially that provider pays for leasing, utilizing our network, that would pay for some of that debt service. In the startup, as Bob talked about, there's such a massive capital investment at the front end that those lease rates wouldn't cover your debt payments at the beginning. And then there's a certain break-even point where you break even and you start to make money. And so that's about how you structure the financing. So if you read the NPR article about Fort Collins, you saw that they project that it's in year 14 that they start making money.
Right.
So we have some of that preliminary analysis, but we would want to do more detailed analysis depending on which model we take to then understand what the right financing approach is so that you don't undercharge or also overcharge.
And that could be done by September?
Yes.
Mary.
So I remember last year when we were talking about the other approach that we were taking, the topic came up with respect to an alternative to fiber to premise. and how that technology was evolving and that it might be a possibility. And it sounds like we've foregone that option. And why?
Sure, I can flesh that out, and then if Julia has anything to add, she can add too. I would say we haven't foregone that option. That's actually part of why we're doing this backbone analysis right now, is there's the potential with what's called 5G wireless connection. So, on your cell phone right now, you have 4G or LTE speeds. 5G wireless is just emerging in the market now, and you can get almost a gigabit speeds using 5G wireless. So there's the potential that in the future, we don't even need fiber drops to each premise. You would get into a neighborhood area, and there would be this 5G wireless node, and then you would have essentially like a modem in your house that would connect wirelessly to that node, and then you'd have internet access. You wouldn't need a wire to your house. And so in some areas that may be adequate for folks. In other areas, they may actually still need a fiber line, or businesses would probably still want a fiber line to their premise.
Don't you still have to have the fiber backbone, though?
Exactly. You'd still have to have the fiber backbone from that node back to all the way where you connect to the broader internet. So you still need a fiber network of some size. That technology is evolving, is just coming out. So depending on where it is, that's why we added that principle about making sure that it's a future-oriented design so that we don't overbuild or design a network that wouldn't support that 5G wireless as it becomes mainstream.
You did a good job describing that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I guess the other option that might be available is mesh networking. And can you speak to that a little bit? That's where you have different, I guess, antennas that provide service to small areas. So could you address that as well, that option?
I will admit I'm less of an expert in mesh networking. What I do understand about it is that is a way to essentially provide internet access. What speeds you can attain by that is the piece that I really don't understand and know enough about. So I don't want to guess. But typically, a lot of times that mesh networking is done through Wi-Fi. Which is, like in this building, we have Wi-Fi. So that protocol for Wi-Fi is different than that 5G wireless. It's a different type of wireless connection to attain the faster speeds.
So could that potentially be an interim solution until we see where we're going with municipal electric utility?
Doing a mesh network?
Yeah, doing that kind of option. I guess you'd still need fiber in some places, so you need it.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think, too, the hard thing about this conversation is you have the confluence of the changing technology options and the ownership options, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So, when we're talking about the fiber-only option, that could be fiber core and backbone, but could also be fiber to premises that we own or lease. And so, as we explore this, all of those options can be laid on the table in terms of pricing, in terms of partnership. So it's really about finding the market mechanism to capture somebody who wants to own just that piece, which is really valuable to the home, versus the backbone and that, or if we wanted to own that and maintain that over time. So.
Thank you.
Bob, and then Jill.
I have one question for Chris and two or three for Bob.